One persistent difficulty in developing clear ideas about politics and economics involves the muddled vocabulary we often use. We freely use words to describe alternative forms of political and economic organization, liberalism or socialism or conservatism or corporatism or libertarianism, without clarifying just what we mean by using words that describe a massive variety of forms. Liberalism is a classic example. In contemporary American political discourse, liberalism describes a set of ideas typically associated with certain elements of the Democratic Party. Ideas that run the gamut from a more robust welfare state to strong civil rights protections for vulnerable minority groups. This is an understanding of liberalism very different from the class and labor oriented liberalism of the New Deal. In fact, most people who called themselves liberal in the past few decades have moved away from the word, instead adopting progressive as a catch-all term for the left-leaning elements of the Democratic Party. Just as often, liberal is used as a sneer and insult from the conservative right, denoting bleeding heart, effete weakness. Of course, none of these associations are properly attributable to liberalism. Liberalism as an ideology emerged in early modern Europe, in tandem with the growth of capitalism and market economies. This is why many small European political parties opposed to the welfare state and in favor of unrestrained market capitalism call themselves liberals. In fact, according to one very prominent analysis, American political culture is entirely liberal. Conservatives and progressives, Democrats and Republicans, all are unconscious followers of the liberal creed. No matter one's politics, the American creed advances certain fundamental assumptions central to liberalism. A market economy that makes no distinctions of status, overseen by a government with limited powers, that enforces contracts and guarantees elemental civil liberties. Unlike Europe or Asia, where this revolutionary belief crashed headlong into reactionary feudalism, oligarchy, and custom, liberalism arrived in America with the first British settlers. It is the origin point of American political culture, which may explain why that culture has so little imagination. It cannot conceive of a political and economic order outside of liberalism. This is not to make an argument about American political culture specifically, but to point out that when we hear the word liberalism, we are apt to make unhelpful associations. Instead, let's consider what Polanyi calls the liberal creed on its own terms, as a novel and disruptive ideology that shaped the basic institutions of modernity, from the liberal state to the market economy to the very concept of what it means to be a human being. Central to the economic concept of liberalism is the insistence on commodifying money, land, and labor. The first item on the liberal agenda was the creation of markets to control the production, value, and exchange flows of these newly designated commodities. As Polanyi argues, only in the 1820s did a liberal alliance of capitalists and politicians succeed in creating the first open markets in money, land, and labor. We have already mentioned how money is commodified by converting it from a medium of exchange into a good of its own, whose value rises or falls depending upon market activity. The institutional expression of this concept of money was the gold standard, the central controlling mechanism of the liberal economy from the 1830s through the Great Depression of the 1930s. The gold standard required that each country's currency be convertible into a fixed amount of gold. The ability of a country's currency to meet this standard determined its value as a tradable commodity. Hence, countries with substantial gold reserves, that is to say, countries with the military muscle capable of extracting gold from weaker countries, countries like Britain, France, the US, etc., controlled a more valuable and powerful currency than weaker countries. This power gave them already powerful states an edge in financing economic expansion. Because there is only a fixed amount of gold available, this insistence on backing a country's finances with its gold supply kept inflation in check, since a government could not print paper money that it couldn't back with the equivalent amount of gold. At the same time, rigid adherence to the gold standard allowed liberal policymakers to resist working class agitation for protectionist reforms. For example, a government could not permit itself to take on the expense of creating a system of unemployment insurance for workers, since the cost would exhaust a treasury held hostage by the demands of the gold standard. The gold standard was the symbol of liberalism's triumph in the 19th century. Under its aegis, the European colonial powers, plus the United States, brought the entire world under the sway of economic liberalism, in which market economies were imposed by force internally and externally. So important was the gold standard that under the general crisis of capitalism between the world wars, champions of liberalism abandoned the rule of law, the constitutional state, and the concept of civil liberties in a desperate defense of the economic mechanism that sustained their power. If the gold standard symbolized the rule of money in a capitalist new order, its corollary was the free market in labor. When Polanyi insists that the inevitable consequence of unrestrained capitalist economics is social desolation, he has in mind the simple realities of that market. Labor is commodified in a market economy because, from the market's point of view, it is just one more input of production, basically no different than the wheat or steel or plastic a producer needs to make their product. Just as a producer needs a steady and reliable flow of resources, so too they need a steady and reliable flow of labor. This labor needs to be secured at the best possible price, meaning the employer wants to get away with paying the employee the smallest amount possible to secure the employee's time and energy. In most any capitalist enterprise, wages are a major expense, so every effort is made to minimize those costs. Liberalism's basic solution to the wage problem is to make sure that labor market participants have no alternative means of support outside the market. The most efficient way to discipline large masses of laborers into accepting low wages is to create a situation where the alternative to that low wage is starvation and exposure. If workers can't rely on public assistance or charity, they will have no choice but to work for whatever wage is offered. There is a clear and compelling logic to this point of view when viewed in the abstract. But so long as we view it in the abstract, we forget that these calculations of efficiency involve exposing real human beings to a life of harassed insecurity and submission. Real people need to be ripped from the social networks that stabilize their lives if they are to perform their necessary function in the labor market. This creative destruction, so beloved by liberals, amounts to a social catastrophe to the people affected. This is why, as Polanyi argues, any expansion of market economics is met with popular resistance. In the early period of liberalism, much of this was limited to sporadic, disorganized attacks by unemployed workers on the factories that had made them obsolete. Over time, as market pressures grew, labor unions formed and fought back, in many places yielding socialist movements that demanded power for the working class immiserated under capitalism. The communist revolutionary movements of the 20th century are, in Polanyi's view, a direct consequence of the logic of market expansion. One of Polanyi's intellectual successors, Charles Lindblom, described liberalism as a system that makes the market a kind of prison for society. In a market society, where the needs of capitalist production are paramount, these economic institutions serve as a kind of prison that prevents major structural changes to the system. The genius of this system, as it were, is that it creates a mechanism that automatically punishes attempts at change. For example, think of the complexities of market societies like ours simplified into two major groups of actors: government and business. Say the government were to make laws interpreted by business interests as restraining their desire to grow. Maybe the government increases the minimum wage, or imposes fines for polluting, or raises taxes on some kinds of profits. Without even consciously needing to do so, business interests can automatically protest these changes, and in fact counter them, by making seemingly non political alterations to their business. In anticipation of new regulations, businesses could reduce output, or raise prices, or dismiss workers, punishing consumers for the government's actions and encouraging irate customers to direct their anger at politicians. A more extreme version of this phenomenon is capital flight. in which investors protest a government's actions by moving their wealth out of the country, sheltering it overseas, and starving the country of investment resources. Capital flights are common, especially in countries that periodically elect left leaning governments. The socialist governments of French President Francois Mitterrand and Brazilian President Lula da Silva were crippled by such capital flights, which are not formally organized protests, but instead spontaneous reactions by capital to the advances of labor. In both France and Brazil, the resulting economic crisis crippled left wing reform efforts before they could be secured. American politicians raise the specter of capital flight when they talk about some government action as carrying the risk of, quote, spooking the markets. President Trump notoriously governs based on this attitude. Any action that could help raise the value of the stock market is interpreted as economically sound, while any action that could lead to a decline in that value is dangerous and must be avoided. In effect, the preferences of investors, as measured by the stock market, holds hostage any large scale attempts at social reform. The market can exercise this power because in market societies, private firms are tasked with organizing and disciplining the workforce, building infrastructure and supply chains, and controlling investment. Private enterprise collectively holds the power to operate the market economy. And as private actors, they cannot be given orders by the state. They must be negotiated with. In this setting, the state is left helpless for all of its power. Because we take for granted the indispensability of the market and the supposed wisdom of the people who steer it, we cannot even imagine alternatives, and so we cut off even the possibility of certain social reforms ever succeeding. This is why post war social democracies sought to tame the market and embed it in a system of popular control that would allow for economic growth without making democratic politics impossible. The long counter revolution against social democracy, usually termed neoliberalism and identified in the US with Reaganism and the politics of privatization it encouraged, has yielded our present day reality, where the needs of the market and its insatiable hunger for human fuel compels us to demand sacrifice from working people and needless death for hundreds of thousands, since even a pandemic can't stop the irresistible logic of the market.